Good afternoon. We'd like to welcome you to today's program, Virtual Tour, NYPL's Equal Rights Amendment, A Century of Speaking Out, sponsored by the Women in Law section and the Committee on Continuing Legal Education of the New York State Bar Association. Today's program will run from 12 p.m. to 1 p.m. And as a reminder, we are still in the renewal period for 2024 NYSBA membership. So if you have not yet registered and renewed for your memberships, please feel free to do so using the link on the slide shown now. And for those of you who have renewed, we thank you for your continued support. During today's program, if you'd like to pose a question to our presenter, please feel free to use the Q&A tab in the Zoom portal. And at this time, it is my pleasure to turn it over to the co-chair of the annual meeting and programming committee for the Women in Law section, Allison Wacker, for some opening remarks. Allie?
Thank you so much, Ernesto. You are critical to our program planning, and we always want to take a quick moment to thank you for all of your efforts. And thank you to all of our participants today. We work hard to bring you timely and informative WILS programming events, which is why we are thrilled this Women's History Month to partner with Cara Dellatte and the New York Public Library to bring you an inside look at their exhibit, the ERA, A Century of Speaking Out. Please be sure to learn about additional programming information on the NYSBA website and professional social media platforms such as LinkedIn. For example, on March 25th, there was a program on advancing women in the legal profession, the pipeline and succession planning, and several other programs are available to register for now through April. We also invite you to think about joining one of our committees, which will give you an opportunity to be a part of our engaging group, use your voice, talent, and passion to benefit women. We are always available for questions, so as you think about joining, please feel free to reach out to us. Cara, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you again for providing us with this virtual tour. We are grateful for your time and efforts to share information from the exhibit you co-curated with us.
Well, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I'm so happy to be here today. And welcome everyone. Thank you for joining. I'm just going to share my screen really quick and then we can get started. Oops, sorry. Still getting used to back on the Zoom. Okay, so this past September through January 6th, the New York Public Library did an exhibition on Equal Rights Amendment, A Century of Speaking Out. It was also the centennial year of the Equal Rights Amendment being proposed to Congress, which was in 1923. So I guess to really kind of begin, I wanted to give all of you a little bit of a backstory of how we kind of got here. So if you all remember back in 2017, it was the New York State anniversary of the centennial of women receiving the right to vote. And then of course in 2020, it was the 100th anniversary of women receiving the right to vote federally. And so a newly minted employee of the New York Public Library, I kind of came in with this idea to do an exhibition. It didn't really matter to me what it would look like, but I wanted to do something kind of recognizing the anniversary federally and, you know, just to celebrate everything that was going on. So myself, along with 4 other of my colleagues, kind of put our heads together and we came up with an exhibition, which I can show you. Let's see. Okay. So it was called initially Her Vote, Her Voice, the Fight for Women's Equality. And this is how far we ended up in the planning of the exhibition. We had design, we had picked out all of our images that we were going to use, all of our artifacts. And then, of course, COVID hit, the library closed. We got as far as planning everything in July of 2020 before we found out that our exhibition had been postponed. We were not reopening to the public really anytime soon in a capacity where an exhibition would have made sense to launch. So unfortunately, all our plans were kind of shut down. And as time wore on, the team of 5 curators became just a team of 2. So all that was left after 2020 was just myself and my colleague Ian Fowler, who is curator of history and government documents at the New York Public Library. So our entire exhibition kind of had to be scuttled in a way because obviously the 100th anniversary of women receiving the right to vote had passed. And we went through quite a few ideas and renditions of what we could do. We had actually included a section of the Equal Rights Amendment in this original exhibition. And so I thought, well, let's just expand upon that. And of course, Ian, being the government document person, was like, well, it's actually the 100-year anniversary, if we want to call it that, of it originally being created. So we can also use that as a jumping off point. So that is really how this idea kind of came to be. I've never really planned a full-fledged exhibition in basically 6 months, but we somehow managed to do it. I'm going to actually give you all a kind of a tour of the exhibition. So I was able to put pieces of it together from our original layout. And then I'll be able to show you at the end what it actually looked like in the hallway. And then of course, as Ernesto said, please, leave comments or questions and I'll answer them at the end. So on, I think your right, my left, is the joint resolution, which this is the original amendment that was created in 1923. It was actually brought to Congress by Mr. Anthony, who is the nephew of Susan B. Anthony. So really cool little tidbit there. And this is what it initially said. So if you look at number 10, it says men and women shall have equal rights throughout the United States and every place subject to its jurisdiction. So that is what the initial amendment had said when it was first pitched to Congress. And then on the right, you'll see the proposed amendment, which is what we ended up having in later on, I think in 1973, this one was put together. And this is the one that we're still kind of using today. They're like playing a little bit around with the language to make it a little bit more inclusive. And to kind of take away the gender association to it. But this is pretty much what we have right now that they're trying to get passed through Congress. Okay, so any time you talk about the Equal Rights Amendment, you really can't not talk about Phyllis Schlafly. So we decided to kind of make her this really like front and center. The first intro panel that you see Phyllis right there. With her Stop ERA signs. So what we did was, this says, in August 1920, the movement for women's equality in the United States won a massive victory with the ratification of the 19th Amendment, granting women the right to vote. The right to the ballot had become a central campaign in a broader struggle to remove gender-based hierarchies and allow women to participate fully in political, social, and economic life. Following the passage of the amendment, Alice Paul, a prominent leader of the suffrage movement, and Crystal Eastman, a lawyer and socialist, which we thought was important to note, began drafting the Equal Rights Amendment in 1921. They presented it to Congress in 1923. This was far more sweeping than the 19th Amendment. The ERA was intended to outlaw gender discrimination. It provided that men and women shall have equal rights throughout the United States and all its jurisdictions. In 1972, after having been stalled in Congress for decades, the ERA was reproposed, approved by Congress, and sent to the states for ratification with a deadline of 1979. It's important to note this was the first time that a deadline was ever put on an amendment. After early widespread success, the campaign to ratify the amendment was squashed by a growing conservative movement spearheaded by Phyllis Schlafly and her group Stop ERA. Schlafly's campaign against the removal of gender-based hierarchies became a central mobilizing plank for conservatives who were gaining strength in national politics and who succeeded in blocking the amendment's ratification. Throughout the campaign for the ERA, its supporters faced the challenge of defining exactly what equal rights for men and women would mean in practice. Many of the white women leading the campaign defined equality narrowly, in a way that did not encompass the realities faced by women of color who remained disenfranchised throughout the South and who faced extreme discrimination in employment, housing, education, and many other avenues of advancement. Struggles over how to define equality alienated some possible ERA supporters, a divisiveness that conservative opponents like Schlafly quickly seized upon. Today, a century after the ERA was introduced, supporters continue to advocate for the amendment in Congress, and conflicts over gender inequality remain central to national politics. It's important to also note that the ERA was just put through again, and of course didn't make it out of committee. So this happens continuously even after it was kind of shut down in 1982. So we can't really talk about the ERA today without talking about where it kind of started. So this is a quote from Crystal Eastman. If you can see it up here, it says, "Men are saying, perhaps thank God, this everlasting women's fight is over. But women, if I know them, are saying, now at last we can begin." So I was very much in love with this quote throughout the planning of the exhibition, and I pushed very hard to have this section named after, to use this quote as part of this section. So what we really wanted to kind of achieve in this section was kind of giving this backstory, this history of, actually the ERA was not started up in the 1970s, which is, I think, when a lot of people kind of remember that second wave feminist movement, where the ERA is kind of on the same platform as gay rights movement happening. Civil rights movement is going on at the same time. So we wanted to kind of give this backstory of like, hey, guess what? This actually was started in 1923, right after ratification of the 19th Amendment, and kind of just sat for quite some time before it picked up again. So this is the first panel that you would see if you were at the exhibition. So ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920 marked an important but incomplete step in women's ongoing battle for equality. The National Women's Party, which suffrage leaders Alice Paul and Lucy Burns created in 1916 to prioritize the passage of a constitutional amendment for women's suffrage, subsequently put its power behind an equal rights amendment. Taking what they had learned from the suffrage movement, Paul and Burns employed similar tactics that had worked well for them in the past. It's important to remember that, because I'll talk more about that as we move forward in the exhibition tour. The 19th Amendment did not unite all women, nor did it erase the decades of discrimination and racism that women of color endured. The NWP and early advocates for the Equal Rights Amendment rejected intersectional understandings of women's oppressions that would have made space for the particular ways that women of color experienced gender and race-based discrimination together. This led women of color to create their own organizations. The fight for women's equality was always broader than the suffrage movement, and in the years after the ratification of the 19th Amendment, many women embraced strategies that diverged from the unilateral campaign for an additional constitutional amendment. Some women threw their energies into the emerging industrial feminist movement, in which women factory workers unionized and won workplace protections, sometimes along gender-based lines. Black women who were sidelined in groups like the NWP fought against lynching, voter disenfranchisement, and workplace and educational discrimination. Other women who viewed reproductive freedom as foundational to women's equality joined the movement to increase women's access to information and healthcare related to family planning, including birth control. Some of these activities would collaborate on the movement for the ERA, but others saw the ERA as an impediment to their own push for equality. So this is the beginning of the first panel where you start to see the material that we selected. I can say that we had so much material that it was hard to make selections for very specific things. So New York Public Library is phenomenal at collecting material, as far as we had tons of things relating to the National Women's Party. You'll see later on, we had a lot of things relating to second wave feminism. Unfortunately, not a lot of stuff regarding women of color or just relating to any of the other movements that were going on that could reflect the diversity of the exhibition. And so we were very careful to kind of put that in the exhibit as you would walk around, to kind of see that we were conscious of that lacking in the exhibit, and we tried to kind of explain it throughout our panels and the material that we did select. So this first item that you see, the suffragist, that had actually been in the original exhibition that we had first started for the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. I had always loved it, and so I pushed really hard to have this included. It's basically, I can't actually even see it because it's two women. Obviously they're not actual women, but they're hugging. each other, basically saying like, at last, we have finally succeeded in the 19th Amendment passing. So what we have here is the suffragist. That's the was done in June 21st, 1919. Next to it is our best tribute is to finish the work they began, which is from the Equal Rights Bulletin. The National Women's Party Press Bulletin is also there. That's from December 4th, 1921. And then we have Equal Rights from September 6, 1922. So this is drawing on one of the successful tactics of the campaign for the 19th Amendment. In 1923, Alice Paul created the Equal Rights newsletter, which was modeled after the suffragist newsletter that the National Women's Party had published during the fight for women's voting rights. Equal Rights distributed information about the NWP and the ERA, reinforcing the importance of the amendment. Nina Allender, whose work was featured prominently in the Suffragists, illustrated many of the cartoons found in the Equal Rights newsletter. Allender's artwork inspired the term Allender Girl, embodiment of the kind of young, energetic activist that typified the movement. So the Suffragist is actually digitized and it's online on HathiTrust and Internet Archive. And you can kind of always pick up when it's a Nina Allender cartoon because her style is very distinct. And you start to kind of see, oh, this is done by Nina Allender. You can tell pretty frequently. And so it's important to also note here that they're pretty much, like as I mentioned before, engaging the same tactics that they had used to pass the 19th Amendment. So they're thinking, okay, outreach-wise, we'll do bulletins, we'll massively produce them, we'll send them out, and then we'll do our same structure where we'll go right to Congress and we'll let people know what's going on through the National Women's Party bulletins, that we're being successful or not. So then we have, let's move this way, the new voter at work, which was the birth control review. So this is a really interesting section. We realized early on in our research that the birth control issue was kind of a delicate nature. We wanted to make sure we included it. We wanted to make sure that we, spoke about it in such a way where we also have to walk that fine line of not really including our own personal bias in our text. So we just wanted to tell the story the best way that we could. And so the fight for women's rights was not monolithic. For example, one group led by the birth control activist, nurse, writer, and sex educator Margaret Sanger emphasized the dangers of pregnancy and childbirth, plus the lack of control over one's own reproductive health as paramount injustices in the lives of women. The Birth Control Review, which she edited, presented birth control as a way to provide women with greater freedom over their lives. Schism like these within the women's movement would persist in the following decades. So you can all see that already right off the bat, we have a group of women that are fighting for birth control, and they're not really associated with the equal rights movement. They're kind of like an offshoot. So already you have a group of women pushing for the Equal Rights Amendment, and then a separate group of women pushing for birth control. That's not really part of the same thing. So the schisms are already there, and it's only going to grow as time goes on. And we can see now in 2024, we're still having these conversations about birth control. So this next item is from the National Women's Party press release. This was done in 1934, and the National Women's Party earned a major post-suffrage victory in 1922 with the passage of the Cable Act. This was known as the Married Women's Citizenship Act. The political and legal status of married women had been a longtime concern of women's activists. U.S. law echoed French practices of coverture in which married women were covered by the legal and political status of their husbands, which meant married women did not possess their own independent legal or political relationship to the state. The Cable Act and the subsequent Equal Nationality Act of 1934 sought to rectify this issue. Women maintained their birthright citizenship regardless of who they married and could pass on their American citizenship to their children. the NWP deemed the victory a small milestone on the road to the broad equality its members sought via the ERA. This was actually a huge victory in a lot of ways. So women that married men that were not American citizens would often lose their citizenship. If their children were born, and their husbands were not American citizens, their children were not considered American citizens because of the nature of the coverture, the practice of the coverture when you got married. So this was a huge change to the way that women were looked at, and especially their children. This next one on the right, you can see, we thought this was important because we wanted people to understand like what women actually do not have. So, you know, you have equal rights for equal work. Do you have the ability to own your own estate? Can you manage your estate? Can you do all these things? And the answer is no. 9 out of 10 times you did not have a lot of the things that people just kind of assumed you would have. So we had to we found this pamphlet that we wanted to kind of explain. People were shocked when they would read this, and like visitors of the exhibition, they could not believe all the things that women actually did not have. So this is from 1935. And this was to help inform the public of the rights denied to women. The National Women's Party created and distributed informational pamphlets. They were designed to be an inexpensive and disposable means of communicating political ideas. Luckily, activists such as Lola Maverick Lloyd saw their value and preserved them in her papers, giving present-day viewers a valuable glimpse of the grassroots tactics of the feminists of her day. Lloyd, who worked with the NWP in the 1930s, preserved a number of pamphlets supporting pacifism, suffrage, birth control, and many other women's issues. So Lola Maverick Lloyd, this is part of her papers that are part of the Manuscripts and Archives department in which I work in. We actually mostly use material from my department. There's a few other departments that are included as you'll see as we go along, but there's 3 main women's collections that are featured throughout the exhibition. Which I thought was really interesting, how we were able to kind of really just rely heavily on these archival pieces. It's also, I think, really interesting to note that a pamphlet that was created basically for disposal, like, you know, you would read it, you would look at it, and then you would discard it, becomes this really important piece 90 years later, 89 years later, as part of an exhibition. And I always think about that as an archivist and, you know, curator of this exhibition, how, you know, interesting it is where we keep things that we think are important to us in this moment. And then someone will come along 50, 60 years later and say, this is actually incredible, and I want to use it for an exhibition or whatever they're going to use it for. So just about a really neat side note. Okay. Sorry, I'm just having trouble moving to my next. There we go. Okay. So here we have the National Women's Party press release. This is from June of 1937 on the left, so it's the longer piece of paper. And then on the right is again, National Women's Party representative card on the Equal Rights Amendment from 1944. So throughout the campaign for the Equal Rights Amendment, the National Women's Party regularly surveyed members of Congress, recording their positions on the amendment in order to focus NWP's lobbying efforts. Although the NWP reported to the general public about the ERA's progress in the House and Senate, the tight focus its members kept on Congress was sometimes to the exclusion of building a mass base of support outside of Washington. So they would basically send these out to congressmen and ask them, do you support or do you not support the Equal Rights Amendment? Just to kind of get an idea of where people stood. They would do this a lot also with the 19th Amendment. So it's kind of another leftover tactic that they're using again for this new amendment. Okay, so here we have this is from April 4th, 1938. This is actually from the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, which is part of the New York Public Library. This is from their Photographs and Prints Division. And it's a picture of the White House Conference Group of the National Women's Council. So having been sidelined and excluded by groups like the National Women's Party, women of color who were barred from voting despite the ratification of the 19th Amendment, created their own groups and organized around their own priorities. The educator and activist Mary McLeod Bethune, which you can see her in the center, founded the National Council for Negro Women in 1935. In 1938, the NCNW sent a delegation to the White House to bring government awareness to the problems facing Black women and children. This is the first time that a group of women of color were able to get an audience at the White House. At this point, this is where we kind of start to see that the National Women's Party is like, oh, maybe it would be helpful to actually work with women of color, and that we're all kind of trying to do the same thing. So it's already 1938 at this point. So we've gotten to this point, it's like 15, 16 years, and they're finally realizing that their tactics are maybe not working the way they thought they would. So here we have, we called this the federal bipartisan support. So at this point, we're about 1944. A lot of this material is from 44, 57, 1960, and 1958. It consists of letters from Senator Harry S. Truman, President Eisenhower, Senator John F. Kennedy, Vice President Richard Nixon, Senator Lyndon B. Johnson, and then Maryland Governor Spiro Agnew, all writing letters basically in support of the Equal Rights Amendment. There's two things I think are really important to kind of take note of. One, this is before any of them have assumed presidency, so they're still in Congress working. And two, it's bipartisan support. So you have Republicans and you have Democrats who are both in favor of the Equal Rights Amendment. It's important to remember that because that will change in time as we go along. So beginning in 1923, the National Women's Party looked to members of both houses of Congress for support of the ERA, eventually expanding this outreach to elected officials at all levels of government. With letters like these, politicians were able to show support for the Equal Rights Amendment and continue to curry favor with the NWP and those that were affiliated with it, while never fully committing to seeing that the amendment would pass through Congress. This political brinkmanship accounts for one of the main reasons the amendment appeared to have broad bipartisan support, but remained stuck in Congress for more than 30 years. So basically, they were just saying, yes, of course, we support this. We think it's wonderful. We will absolutely push it through, but then doing nothing. And this went on for a pretty long time. Okay, so here we have Pauli Murray. She was born in Baltimore in 1910. And her name was Anna Pauline, but she went by Pauli Murray. They were a poet, a writer, an activist, an Episcopal priest, a labor organizer, and a legal theorist. They are best known for their work with the American Civil Liberties Union and the Civil Rights Movement. But what's important for this exhibition is to note that in 1966, so we've jumped a little bit at this point, if you're looking at the exhibition in person, after the federal bipartisan support section, we're now kind of slowly segueing into the second feminist movement. And so Pauli Murray, we felt fit perfectly with the beginning of the introduction to this new section. So in 1966, she co-founded the National Organization for Women, which we know now as NOW, with Betty Friedan, Shirley Chisholm, Muriel Fox, and many others. NOW was part of a wave of new activism around women's rights inspired by the civil rights movement, and it would lead the fight for the ERA in the following decades. So we've kind of transitioned off of the National Women's Party. NOW has taken over the fight. NOW is very diverse. It's way more inclusive than the National Women's Party. Still not as inclusive as it needed to be, and we'll talk about that as we continue, but they're aware that they need diverse support, and they're aware that all women need to be included and not just white women at this point. So here we have from left to right, we have a letter to Anna Arnold Hedgeman, which is from the Schomburg Center, as is the Pauli Murray photograph. And Anna Arnold Hedgeman was an activist, a preacher, and the first female member of the Administrative Planning Committee for the 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. She was also one of the 49 co-founders of the National Organization for Women. Her inclusion was a major shift in the relationship between women of color and the newly organized NOW. For the first time, a major organization was conscious of the history of racism within the women's movement and sought to address that. Hedgeman received these letters from Dorothy Hill, a white woman and teacher from Pennsylvania, who faced discrimination from her employer for being pregnant. Hill wrote to Hedgeman for support and assistance in her capacity as a member of NOW. So essentially, Hill was a teacher. She was on leave. She became pregnant, and her employer let her go because they didn't want anyone that was pregnant. They felt that they should be not working. And so NOW existed to help women in these types of situations. And what we thought was really amazing and incredible was that a white woman wrote to a woman of color for help. And this is where you really start to see the shift, which we wanted to make sure we included. The next letter that you see is a letter to Betty Friedan from Colleen Boland. So Betty Friedan, one of the leaders of the newly organized National Organization for Women, and Colleen Boland, who was the president of the Airline Stewards and Stewardesses Association, are in correspondence with one another in the following letter. Boland is resigning from her position on the NOW board due to a conflict of interest with her position as president of the ALSSA. Boland had approached NOW previously for assistance with the airline's policy of forcing women into retirement at the age of 32 or when they married. At the time, policies that codified such gender-based discrimination were common across all sectors of the US workforce. Okay, so we have now gotten to the ERA reproposed. So this is section 2. This covers 1969 to 1977. And here is where you see the second wave feminism. So with the rise of the modern women's movements in the United States in the 1960s and 70s, enthusiasm for the Equal Rights Amendment swelled. Mass protest marches, information campaigns, and the founding of a variety of women's rights-based organizations such as the National Organization for Women gave the appearance that the ERA had broken through to the mainstream and overcome the political infighting that had plagued it in the previous decades. The Equal Rights Amendment also garnered increasing support from a new class of federal lawmakers, including Representatives Martha Griffiths and Shirley Chisholm. Griffiths was the first woman to serve on the influential House Committee on Ways and Means, while Chisholm was the first Black woman elected to Congress. Representative Griffiths reintroduced the ERA to Congress in 1971, overcoming the resistance of the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, Representative Emanuel Seller, who had refused to hold a committee hearing on the ERA for over 30 years. After its reintroduction, the ERA was overwhelmingly approved by the House of Representatives on October 12, 1971, and by the Senate on March 22, 1972. It was then up to the states to ratify it. Congress set a ratification deadline of March 22, 1979, which was later extended to June 30th of 1982. Within a year of approval by Congress, we had 30 states that had ratified the amendment, and by 1977, the amendment had received 35 of the necessary 38 ratifications. With this initial bipartisan support, which included both political parties, both houses of Congress, and Presidents Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, and Jimmy Carter, ERA activists were understandably optimistic about its ratification. The cultural and political future of the ERA was, however, anything but certain. The ERA was by far not the only central issue for women's rights groups at the time, especially those that advocated for women of color. Other mass movements, such as those for civil rights, workers' rights, and gay rights, also attracted many of those who had been marginalized or ignored by the original push for the ERA. The amorphous nature of the amendment also raised important practical and conceptual questions that lacked conscious answers, such as what even was gender equality? How would the ERA affect women's day-to-day lives? Questions like these, combined with the rise of a well-organized conservative movement in the United States, would make securing ratifications from 3 more states for passage of the ERA far more difficult than organizers ever anticipated. So this section here, we used a quote again: the Constitution they, the framers, wrote was designed to protect the rights of white male citizens, as there were no Black founding fathers, there were no founding mothers, a great pity on both counts. It is not too late to complete the work they left undone. Today, here, we should start to do so. This is Shirley Chisholm talking about the ERA amendment. So here we have a picture on the left of the Red Stockings, which is an oppressed majority demands its rights. So this section, we really kind of wanted to show what else was going on besides the push for the ERA. So we have this Red Stocking movement. They took their name as a reclaiming of the term blue stocking, a label that was disparagingly pinned on feminists of earlier centuries, plus red for evolution. And in this picture, members of the Red Stockings engage in a conscientious right-raising session to gain political insights from shared feelings and experiences. So the poster on the wall, which I'm sure nobody can see, but it says, "Speak pains to recall pains, the Chinese Revolution, tell it like it is, the Black Revolution, bitch, sisters, bitch, the final revolution." And this picture is from a Life magazine, December 12th, 1969. The next photo that you see is labeled "The Last Suffragette." There were thoughts at first that that was Alice Paul, but it's been debunked. It's not, but we're not sure who that actually is. And then right underneath it is the women in large parade down Fifth Avenue on the 50th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment, which granted women the right to vote. So these 2 photographs were taken at the Women's Strike for Equality, the largest U.S. women's march at the time, which occurred on August 26, 1970. The images represent the breadth and growth of the movement, which many felt was coalescing around key issues such as political rights for women, social equality in relationships such as marriage, abortion on demand, equal opportunity in the workforce, and free childcare. The strike, which celebrated the 50th anniversary of the passing of the 19th Amendment, was spearheaded by Betty Friedan and sponsored by the National Organization for Women. Part of the success of mass marches such as this was due to more radical women's groups making now seem more mainstream by pushing the movements to the left, now appeared less controversial. Attendance estimated for the New York City strike alone were as high as 50,000 people, and more protested throughout the country. At the time of the strike, Congress was debating the Equal Rights Amendment. The protest served as a warning to politicians to vote for the amendment or risk losing their seats in the next election. So then we have, we did like a section kind of celebrating Shirley Chisholm and her work relating to the ERA amendment. So we have a photo of her, her speaking in 1970, and then right next to her is political campaign materials. So she ran for president, so 4 years after she became the first African-American woman in Congress. In 1972, she launched a bid to become the Democratic nominee for president of the United States, another first for an African-American woman. Throughout her career in Congress, Chisholm was a staunch advocate for women's rights and one of the most articulate advocates for the ERA and how it would positively impact women's everyday lives. In numerous speeches in Congress and on the campaign trail, she would point out the ambiguities and inconsistencies in the legal system, especially for Black women who often received heavier criminal penalties than men who committed the same crime, and how the ERA would address these problems. In a speech in favor of the ERA in August 1970, she declared, "The Constitution, well, they, the framers, wrote was designed to protect the rights of white male citizens, as there were no Black founding fathers, there was no founding mothers, a great pity on both counts. It is not too late to complete the work they left undone. Today here, we should start to do so." Obviously, that's the same quote that I read earlier. We really thought long and hard about what quotes to use to kind of pull out, because the nature of exhibitions is not everyone reads and looks at every single panel. And so we wanted people to kind of like zero in on certain things and then maybe then read a panel about it. So right next to it, you'll see this black box. So we had one little audio feature, and that was an excerpt of Shirley Chisholm's victory celebration when she was elected to Congress in 1968. And then another audio recording from the show called Positively Black in 1983. And that's her again talking about what it was like to run for Congress and run for president. Unfortunately, all of her speeches that had to do with the ERA were done before C-SPAN existed, and so we weren't able to get anything from that to use, which we were really kind of sad about, but we felt that what we were able to provide, people found to be really great. Okay. So we also wanted to kind of talk about, religion and how different groups were for the Equal Rights Amendment. So on your left, you'll see Catholics in the Equal Rights Amendment, so they're in support of it. And then why religious groups support the ERA. This is from 1972 and 1981 respectively. So the Religious Committee for the ERA was an organization of Catholic, Protestant, and Jewish groups that worked to place the Equal Rights Amendment in the interfaith context supported by contemporary religious doctrine as well as biblical text. The committee specifically pointed out that the ERA would have no authority over religious policies and practices, including ordination. And so we felt it was important to kind of mention this because later on you'll see how religion begins to play a more important part in the debate over the Equal Rights Amendment. So this next one, we have What's in It for Black Women. This actually ended up being such a powerful pamphlet that we did a QR code so people could scan it and look at the entire thing online. But this is from the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights circa 1973. And this pamphlet's contents are a reprint of the article by Frankie Muse Freeman titled What's in It for Black Women, which was originally published in the magazine Focus Midwest. Freeman was an African-American civil rights attorney and the first woman to be appointed to the United States Commission on Civil Rights, a bipartisan federal fact-finding body that investigates complaints alleging discrimination on the basis of race, sex, national origin, and/or disability. The article's unique focal point in the final section titled The Importance of the ERA to Blacks. Here, Freeman elucidates the positive impact the ERA would have on sentencing provisions for Black women convicted of crimes, double jeopardy, and on unemployment rates among Black women. Freeman concludes her article by invoking the legal framework of the 14th Amendment, which provides for equal protection under the laws for all citizens and placing the comparable impact the Equal Rights Amendment would have within that framework. So we thought this was incredibly important to the exhibition, and so of course we included it. On the right, this is from ERA Central, which was basically the central location, the name of all of the flyers and advertising about the ERA would come out of. This is also from the Georgia Lloyd papers. If you remember the name Lloyd, this is actually the daughter of Lola Maverick Lloyd, whose papers were prominently featured in the first section panel. So we have both mother and daughter's papers. So we're very lucky to have both. So this is the Women's International Day Parade that we featured here. And then this final section of the exhibition, which I'm sure all of you know who Phyllis Schlafly is. So Phyllis Schlafly and Stop ERA. So the pro-ERA movement would face its biggest threat from Phyllis Schlafly, a longtime Republican activist who had lost the 1952 bid for Congress. She allied with the emerging religious right and launched a campaign to stop the Equal Rights Amendment. After earning a master's degree in government in 1945, she worked at the anti-communist and pro-business American Enterprise Association, which was the forerunner of the American Enterprise Institute. In the 1970s, she organized the Stop ERA campaign, which stood for Stop Taking Our Privileges. A mother of 6, Schlafly argued that the ERA would not win new gains for women. Instead, it would eliminate Social Security's death benefits for dependent wives, the exemption from the military draft, and the precedent that mothers obtained custody over their children in divorce cases. Schlafly assembled an army of mimeographers who met at her house and printed pamphlets, memos, flyers, and other documents to promote her Stop ERA campaign. Many of these women were housewives, but they were also active in the National Federation of Republican Women, and some were even wives of prominent congressional representatives. The anti-ERA campaign was well organized and successful in bringing many women to the cause, portraying its supporters as people who hate men, marriage, and children, and who will destroy morality and the family. A lot of the rhetoric we kind of see today, so not much has changed. So this entire section here, we focused on Dorothy Fruch's papers. She was a suffragist, but also against the ERA because she felt that the ERA would lead to communism, which was kind of a common thing at this time amongst people. So we can see here that there's this is just some of the flyers and the memos that they used. A lot of it was disinformation. So the ERA coalition would say, this is what the ERA will do for you. And they Stop ERA would take that and reverse it and basically lie. And people would be inundated with all of these pamphlets and memos and things and not really know what to believe. So like the green item on the bottom, which says, can you afford the ERA? It's saying that, you know, in small letters, you're going to end up being drafted. It's going to raise your taxes. And all of this, of course, is a lie, but they were well organized and their flyers and their memos were well done. And they grab people's attention, which is important. You can also see, and I'll show you in the next section, that it's very sophisticated compared to the work that the ERA coalition was producing. So the Phyllis Schlafly report is something that she started up in 1968. It mostly focused on foreign policy. She was very much obsessed with foreign policy and communism at the time. And then in 1972, we see a dramatic shift. She starts using the Phyllis Schlafly report, which is her own report that she wrote, dedicated solely to stopping the ERA. And this would go out to countless people across the United States. And she would print them and send them out continuously over and over and over again. And so here you see the red ink. That's actually Dorothy Fruch's highlighting sections that she felt were important to help justify her points that she was making to people about also how the ERA will be detrimental if it's passed. So one of the things I really want to point out quickly is that Illinois ended up becoming this crucial battleground state. It's important to note that Phyllis Schlafly was from Springfield, so that was considered downstate, but the ERA coalition focused heavily on Chicago, and that would ultimately be kind of their demise because Phyllis knew all the congressmen in Illinois. She knew how to play that game, and her approach was like, here's a basket of muffins. You know, how can we help you? How can we do this? Whereas the ERA coalition was much more like, get in your face, you know, this is why you should vote. They would send out the ERA coloring book. Where can we get the ERA coloring book? Come and learn all about the ERA. You can see it's kind of like a little crude and a little elementary, where the Stop ERA material is much more sophisticated in a lot of ways. And then they're doing the same thing that the Stop ERA is doing. They're just reprinting the same things about what the ERA will do for you. And then Stop ERA is sending out the wrong information, but it's working. And then they're just reprinting that, but saying what it will do. So it's just back and forth over and over again. And we know now this does not work. It's not effective as a political, you know, push for anything. So here we have bringing home equality. So this is just another example of the material that we found. This is from 1972. So as momentum to pass the Equal Rights Amendment grew, anti-ERA factions began to focus their talking points extensively on the supposedly negative effects the ERA would have on the family, such as forcing women into the workforce, making them responsible for half a family's income, and making them subject to the draft. This was a constant thing over and over again about the draft. In this pamphlet, the National Federation for Business and Professional Women's Clubs, which mentored and supported women entering the professional level workforce and was pro-ERA, addressed these concerns head on. The pamphlet emphasizes that the ERA will elevate the role of mother and housewife to the status of other professions thus increasing the desirability of homemaking as a career. This rhetoric served a dual purpose: to counter the anti-ERA movement and to acknowledge the factions on the pro-ERA side that wanted the center message that wanted to center the message that work done in the home was indeed labor. We have to remember that at least for me, I think of Phyllis as the ultimate feminist. Like, she would go on to get her law degree. She did all this work to stop the ERA amendment. She also had 6 children. She raised her 6 kids. And then she also was able to do all of these other things. So, like, to me, well, that's what we're trying to achieve here, right? Like, this balance of being able to work and also have a family. But she was completely opposed to the ERA because she felt women should also be home. I always find her to be a very interesting character. So here we have some letters from the Miggs Woodside collection, which was a recent acquisition. And I just want to kind of point your attention to the Stop ERA memo on the bottom, and there you have Phyllis's signature. She's writing to the president of American Can Company, so think like Dixie Cup, saying that she'd heard that William Woodside was pro-ERA and decided that he wasn't going to house any conventions or meetings in states that were not passing for ratification. And so she had heard about this, and she wrote him a letter basically saying that is this true? I'm going to turn around and send out all of these memos saying that people should boycott your company if this is true. And also, I'm a shareholder, which we think is not true. She was just trying to, like, be a bully in a sense. But we thought this was great to include, of course, because we didn't really have anything with her signature. So we have a letter from her as well as actual memo, like letterhead with the Stop ERA on it. So now we're getting into like 77 and the early 80s, and we start to see where things are shifting now, becoming more about religion, about gay rights. And a lot of it is now, we are going to essentially, if you vote for the ERA amendment, it's going to allow homosexuals to adopt a child. It's going to allow homosexuals to have a family. And so that was they were sort of like transitioning, like save our children kind of thing. So that you can see that here with this rhetoric starting up. Oops. So this is the last image in the exhibition. It's from the National Women's Conference in 1977. If you were standing in the exhibition, excuse me, diagonally across from it, you would be looking at the picture of Phyllis Schlafly in the Stop ERA. We purposely did that because Phyllis rented a convention hall across the street from where the National Women's Conference was happening in 1977 and hosted a Stop ERA convention at the same time. If anyone saw Mrs. America on Hulu, this is featured in the TV show. So here you're looking at Lady Bird Johnson, Betty Ford, Rosalind Carter, and Bella Abzug passing the torch basically to the younger generation. What would end up happening is Reagan would become president in 1981. He would defund the National Women's Conference. This was recommended to be done by Carter and Ford. So he basically just defunded the money, and then they no longer had any money to do it anymore. And so it just died. So since 1982, the ERA has been introduced in Congress once every session and still has yet to be ratified. Despite this failure, the women's movement won many gains in the 1960s and 70s, and as a result, women moved more fully into political and economic life in the decades that followed. Even with these advances, however, many of the demands that women organized around the 1920s continue to resonate with women today. The Me Too movement highlighted issues of sexual harassment and gender discrimination in the workplace that echoed complaints women factory workers made in the early 20th century. The COVID-19 pandemic revealed the intense burdens related to childcare and domestic labor that many women continue to face today. The recent repeal of Roe v. Wade has drastically curtailed women's access to reproductive health care. Some argue in violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, rendering the concerns of the early birth control activists newly relevant again. These contemporary issues would not prove entirely unfamiliar to the original drafters of the ERA, illustrating that in this centennial year of the Equal Rights Amendment, debates about gender equality continue to be at the center of US politics. My co-curator and I really struggled on how to end this exhibition because everyone wanted to end on a happy note, and we were like, how is that possible? A lot of these things were happening while we were writing the text, like Roe v. Wade being reversed. So we kind of just wanted to show that this is still an ongoing struggle. They're still advocating to have this passed in Congress even today. We hope that it's passed one day. But basically that is the exhibition in a nutshell. I just wanted to also show very quickly, this is what it actually looked like in the hallway. So when you walked in, you can see the lintel here. It says Equal Rights Amendment, a century of speaking out. And then here we have that one scene I showed you before with Phyllis on the right and ERA Yes on the left. This is what it looks like from the other end. And there's the two versions of the amendment. All right, and I think I've talked long enough. Does anyone have any questions?
Cara Dellatte, thank you again so much. And, in particular to New York State, we wanted to share this virtual tour as an educational opportunity for folks, knowing that we do have an Equal Rights Amendment on the ballot this November. So it is extremely powerful to have the understanding and the historical perspective that you shared with us today as people take to consider flipping that ballot in November. So thank you.
Of course.
We did have some questions that came in along the way. I tried to address them. One you may want to touch on briefly that I did not respond to on your behalf was, had you found anything about the women who did support the ERA who may have found Phyllis Schlafly's behavior response remarkably hypocritical?
We didn't find anything directly saying it. What we had as far as archival material was a lot of the flyers and the memos and the posters. So it's kind of not any really letters kind of saying it. We had read a lot of secondary sources, and in there you can kind of see a lot of like Betty Friedan, and a lot of the other women that were involved, just thinking that she was ridiculous. I think again that the Mrs. America TV show does a really good job of kind of showing the way she was treated and the way everyone really felt about her. They never took her seriously. They thought that she was ridiculous, and they felt that there was no way that to them, especially when they got to 35 states being ratified, there was absolutely no way that it wasn't going to pass. They just could not fathom how it would fail. And I think that was their downfall, that they did not take her seriously. They didn't realize how good she was at organizing and the grassroots effort that she had. And then let's remember, her husband, was in Congress. She had a long history of dealing with Republican congressmen. She knew that showing up to the Illinois, congressional court with a basket of muffins was far more productive than spilling pig's blood on the floor, which is what the pro-ERA coalition did at one point. And so, they didn't want to deal with this radical arm of the ERA. They wanted to see what she was kind of portraying. And when she kind of when she hooked up with the religious right, that's where we actually see the rise of the moral majority and the rise of what we now have as the Christian right that we know of in America. So I think we have to also remember and take into account that they've played this long game. When Roe v. Wade passed in 1972, they immediately sought to figure out how they could get rid of it. And so we kind of see that as we work through the exhibition,
Mhm.
we see their plans. Like they have a very steady plan. The right, the conservatives, especially during this particular time, are very well organized and they're all united for one thing. Whereas the ERA coalition is kind of, I hate to say it, but they're a little discombobulated. Like they're trying to be as inclusive as they possibly can. And in that effort to be as inclusive as they possibly can, they're actually being exclusive and they're eliminating people. And so you're ending up with factions breaking off and forming their own groups to get their own things done, and they're losing people. And
Mhm.
it's kind of like breaking up. And I
Mhm.
think that's part of the reason why they were also unsuccessful in
Mm.
passing it.
Thank you. I know, Ernesto, we have gone a bit over time.
Sorry.
No, this was phenomenal. Thank you so much for bringing us into this exhibit and sharing with us all of the materials that you were able to bring into the exhibit itself. I'm sorry we missed it in person, but we're so fortunate to have you walk us through it now.
So glad to do this. Hope everyone enjoyed it. It was definitely a wonderful experience and something that I wish could be up longer, but of course we can't keep paper up with light and humidity for more than 4 months. So our
Hmm.
exhibitions have to be on a frequent up and down kind of system, and that's why it closed pretty quickly. But I'm glad I was able to kind of bring everybody into it to kind of see what it looked like, since you couldn't be there.
Thank you.
Yes, I would just like to echo Ali's sentiments. Cara, thank you so much for that presentation. Wonderfully done, so educational, timely, and important for us here. I would like to thank you again for joining us. This does conclude our program, and please make sure to return to your My Learning dashboard and complete the course evaluation. Thank you for choosing New York State Bar Association programs, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Bye, everyone.